May 15, 1945. 05:30 a.m. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. A flat, humid morning that smells of wet earth, diesel, and the faint iron tang of barbed wire. The dawn light slips across rows of canvas huts and brick barracks, silvering helmet rims and the polished barrels of M1 carbines slung over the shoulders of sentries. Corporal James Miller, a lean 26-year-old from Akron, wipes dew from his brow with the back of a gloved hand and squints down the line. Lieutenant Robert Halsey walks beside him, map case under his arm, soft-soled boots whispering on compacted gravel. They're Americans who have seen the European maps change in ink and blood. They've guarded trains crossing continents and men who fled towns that no longer exist. Today they wait for a train of human cargo, tired, wary German soldiers who have been told in the rumor fog of war that Allied captivity is a long, brutal thing. From the shadowed edge of the camp, a truck grinds to a stop. The cargo bed opens and a dozen figures slide down, greatcoats damp with travel, field caps in hands, eyes narrowed against both sun and uncertainty. The senior among them unmasks himself with a practiced motion. Feldwebel Karl Müller, 34, rueful mustache, scars mapped faintly across a knuckled finger from some Eastern Front skirmish. Next to him, Lieutenant Hans Becker, 29, hair prematurely threadbare from command stress, keeps his chin level and counts heads under his breath. Their boots hit the dirt and their gazes sweep the camp. Stacks of army cots, lines of wash hung like faded flags, a tall utilitarian wooden hut whose single window is flanked by an American flag. The men had expected something different. Concrete cells, shouting sentries, letters censored into useless blanks. They were prepared as soldiers are for the worst. The Americans give orders in clipped, efficient English. Form in twos. Keep hands where we can see them. Miller's voice is even. Halsey's eyes register exhaustion and something else, a wearied patience. The Germans obey, forming into a neat, wary column, sweat beads along necklines in the southern heat. A small boy from the nearby town, a civilian worker, watches from behind a pile of lumber, curiosity drawn like a magnet. He has never seen prisoners so close. A church bell rings in the distance, a lazy, dissonant counterpoint to the sharp metallic click of rifle actions as guards check chambers and release safeties. They are shepherded toward a long, low building stamped with an official placard, American Red Cross Prisoner of War Mail Office. The sight produces a ripple of disbelief through the Germans. They had been told by officers and rumors alike that mail would be stripped of everything personal, that friendships would be dissected by ink searchers and returned as sterile fragments of truth. Instead, here is a building with a counter, shelves of envelopes, stacks of paper and pencils, Red Cross parcels with the familiar emblem. A young army clerk with a quiff of hair and a smile too quick for comfort hands out forms. Names, next of kin, address, language. He speaks in clear, heavily accented German with the easy command of someone who learned the language in a Pennsylvania classroom. The Germans blink. Feldwebel Müller tapes the strap of his satchel in a way that suggests a man trying to fasten his old assumptions. They do not hold. A narrow room labeled censorship sits adjacent. Inside, a single table, 8 chairs, and 2 women in civilian clothing. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a Red Cross volunteer with a soft voice and quick hands, and Sergeant Anna Lewis, a stern-faced army censor whose spectacles perch like punctuation on her nose. Their job is supposed to be mechanical. Read, blot, clip out anything that might harm military security. But the process here is different than the men expect. The censors move with efficiency, yes, but also with a practiced lightness. They are trained to look for maps, diagrams, morale-affecting propaganda, coded phrases. Not the smell of a child's hair described in a line of homesick prose, the mention of a favorite baker, the way someone signs their name. They fold letters with care rather than cruelty. Feldwebel Müller, when first given paper and a stubby pencil, staggers not from the weight of his years but from the thinness of the expectation that this piece of paper could be his lifeline. He pins his coat, bends, and scrawls in blocky script to a wife he hasn't seen in 2 years. His hand trembles and the words feel fragile. Meine Anna, ich lebe. Ich bin in Amerika. Ich darf schreiben. Those sentences, I live. I am in America. I may write, look almost insolent to him, an act of permission that feels like liberty. Around him, others begin to write. A young corporal traces the outline of his child's face with words. Another sketches in shorthand the ritual of a Sunday they recall under a church spire in Freiburg. The paper becomes a confession booth, a place where men whisper home. Outside the censorship window, Lieutenant Halsey watches the first batch of envelopes pass through the clamp of Allied bureaucracy. He had fought through hedgerows. He had seen fortress towns burn. Still, there is a flash of something: sympathy, pragmatism, or perhaps the recognition that war breaks men as well as nations. He signs off on the manifests and stamps them with the neat official hand of an officer who knows that order can be an expression of humanity, not only control. The Americans' approach is methodical rather than punitive, a careful reading for security risk, a red pencil to cross a phrase that might betray a troop movement, but otherwise lines left intact. A picture of a daughter clings to a page. A recipe scrapes into the margins. Nothing is blacked out wholesale. Nothing is shredded for the pleasure of power. News and rumors, like water finding cracks, travel fast among the huts. The men gossip at dusk, leaning over mess tins, voices low as the cicadas rise. "They let us write," says Becker, astonishment sharpening his vowels. "They do not cut out the little things." Carl Miller looks across the shared tin of coffee and allows himself a broken smile, a fissure that both signals disbelief and the dangerous hope that people can be other than enemies. Around the camp, a new rhythm sets in. Mornings of drill and roll call, afternoons of letter writing, evenings where words fold into envelopes and are sealed with an absent hand. June 4th, 1945. The sun sets in slow, syrupy waves over Camp Ruston. The air smells of pine tar and boiled beans, thick enough to cling to every stitch of khaki and every breath drawn inside the perimeter fence. Along the barracks, German prisoners sit on crates or the edges of their bunks, their letters bundled in twine, awaiting pickup. The camp's mail truck, a dull olive Dodge WC with the Red Cross emblem stenciled on its side, coughs to life, its rear gate creaking like a stubborn hinge. Each letter is counted, stacked, and logged by the mail clerk, Private Donnelly, a 19-year-old who has never seen Europe and never fired a weapon in anger. He jokes with Sergeant Lewis as he works. To him, the letters are numbers, but to the men watching from the wire, they are veins reaching home. Inside Barracks 14B, the low hum of conversation weaves through cigarette smoke and the faint thrum of a radio playing Glenn Miller from the guardhouse. Feldwebel Carl Miller sits cross-legged on his cot, his letter already written but his thoughts still tangled in it. The first time he wrote, he could hardly believe it would be sent. Now 2 weeks later, the word has come back. The letters arrived in Germany. Replies have begun trickling in. The postman's arrival, an American corporal with a burlap sack and an indifferent expression, draws the same attention as a priest at the front of a chapel. Men rise from their bunks, hats off, eyes forward. When their names are called, voices tremble. Becker, Hans. The young lieutenant stands, hand raised. He takes the envelope with a motion both formal and fragile. The handwriting on the front, his mother's looping script, hits him harder than any artillery concussion. He turns away from the room, the noise fading into the cotton of his thoughts. The letter is dated May 8th, the day Germany surrendered. She writes of silence in the streets, of neighbors whispering, of hunger already at the door, and yet she writes also of relief. "Now you can come home, my son. They say the Americans are treating you fairly. Write me soon. Tell me if it's true." Becker stares at those words. Is it true? The question feels heavy, echoing between his ribs. He looks around the barracks, the neat bunks, the food portions, the guards who are strict but not cruel. The letters he has sent were not mutilated by ink or scissors. The last one even included a line about the taste of Louisiana peaches, and it passed. In a war built on propaganda, on whispered lies and official truths, the simplest fact, that he could write his mother freely, feels like a kind of revolution. At the same hour on the other side of the camp, Sergeant Lewis sits beneath a bare bulb in the censorship room. Her pen moves like a surgeon's instrument over foreign handwriting. She reads phrases slowly, sounding them out with quiet care. Some letters she stamps without comment. A few she sets aside, ones that mention troop positions or coded references to units. But the vast majority? They flow through untouched. She reads the lines not as intelligence but as confession. She sees men describe hunger, the smell of their wives' perfume, the sound of a bicycle chain squeaking in the cold morning streets of Bremen. Each letter reminds her that her brother, who fought in the Ardennes and never came back, might have sounded just like these men if fate had been reversed. Outside, a storm brews in the southern distance. Lightning crawls along the horizon, thunder rolling like slow applause. In the barracks, Becker's letter shakes slightly in his hands as the first drops of rain drum against the tin roof. Across from him, Miller watches the weather through the slit of a window and says half to himself, "The Americans? They let us speak." His voice carries a quiet disbelief. "Do they not fear what we will say?" Becker answers after a long silence. "Maybe they don't need to fear words. Only silence." The night grows thick with humidity and memory. Some men lie awake, whispering the names of their children to themselves, as if speaking them aloud might bridge the Atlantic. The letters, sealed and stamped, are small vessels of hope drifting toward a ruined continent. For the first time in years, these soldiers of the once mighty Wehrmacht are learning the strange luxury of being heard. 2 weeks later, the replies multiply. Entire bundles of envelopes arrive, marked with strange stamps, some bearing the postmarks of shattered German cities: Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. The men pore over each one like archaeologists uncovering remnants of a lost civilization. Their civilization. Through these letters, they learn that their families are surviving in the rubble, that children are growing without fathers, that life, barely, continues. Even the guards notice the change. The camp feels less tense, less charged with the electricity of bitterness. Fights over cigarettes diminish. The prisoners' orchestra practices longer. Miller even catches Corporal Miller listening at the open window, tapping his boot to their violin's rhythm. The war for these few acres of fenced Louisiana earth seems to have paused rather than ended. That night, Becker writes a new letter. He begins with the same phrase as before, meine liebe Mutter, but the words that follow are lighter, even defiant. He writes not of war, not of hunger, but of the way the American sun hits the wire in the morning, how it glows gold like melted coins. He writes that he has begun helping in the camp garden, that he now knows the names of flowers in English. At the bottom, he adds one final line before sealing the envelope. "Tell everyone, words are still free, even here." The letter will pass through the censor's hands, through the Red Cross pouch, across the Atlantic, and into a Europe still learning how to breathe. It will arrive in a cracked mailbox on a cobbled street in Göttingen, where a mother will cry, not because her son is imprisoned, but because his handwriting looks alive again. July 1945. The cicadas had begun their endless chorus, a sound that wrapped itself around Camp Ruston like the steady ticking of time. The war in Europe was officially over, yet here, across the ocean from the ruins, the consequences still walked, talked, and smoked cigarettes behind barbed wire. But something had shifted. The Germans had begun to adapt, even thrive in small ways. The letters home had become the heartbeat of the camp. Every Thursday afternoon, when the Red Cross truck arrived with a sack of incoming mail, the camp seemed to pause its routine. Hammers in the workshops went silent. Football games stopped mid-play. Even the guards leaned forward slightly, watching the ritual unfold like priests observing a ceremony. Lieutenant Robert Halsey stood near the fence line, clipboard under his arm, cigarette balanced between 2 fingers. His expression was neutral, but his mind wandered. He had read reports from other camps, those in Arizona, Nebraska, Wisconsin. Most of them told similar stories. German POWs amazed by the humane treatment, baffled by how freely they were allowed to write home. Some of them couldn't understand it. Others didn't trust it. "They think it's a trick," one report had said. "They expect punishment hidden beneath kindness." But here, Halsey saw the results firsthand. The discipline was firm but fair, and the mail, those small bridges of ink and paper, had changed everything. He walked past a line of Germans now seated on benches outside the mail hut, each with pen and envelope, writing in quiet concentration. No guards loomed over them. None were needed. A few men even smiled as they wrote. He paused beside Müller, who was bent over his notebook. "Feldwebel," Halsey said in steady German. "You're writing again, I see." Müller looked up, cautious at first, then nodded. "Yes, Herr Lieutenant. I write to my wife every week now. It helps." "Good." Halsey gestured to the paper. "Tell her you're doing fine. That's the truth, isn't it?" Müller hesitated, eyes lowering to the letter. "Yes, though I'm not sure she'll believe it. She still thinks I must be suffering." Halsey exhaled smoke slowly. "Then surprise her." He turned away, leaving Miller to his thoughts. Inside the mailroom, Sergeant Lewis continued her meticulous work. Piles of letters, hundreds each week, covered the long wooden table. She had grown used to the neat script, the faint scent of sweat and soap on the paper, the small mistakes that betrayed a foreign handwriting in borrowed calm. A few of the censors from other camps mocked the policy, calling it soft-hearted nonsense. But Lewis disagreed. She had seen how the letters changed the men. The first weeks had been tense, eyes hard, tempers short, the air thick with resentment. But the moment those letters began passing through, unbroken, unscarred, the camp had softened. Humanity had crept back in through paper and ink. She stamped another letter and passed it into the outgoing tray. No codes, no complaints, no bitterness, she murmured. Just homesick men. From across the room, Corporal Donnelly grinned. Guess even the enemy's got a heart, huh? Lewis shot him a look. They're soldiers, same as ours. They just lost first. That evening, Becker found himself standing near the fence line, watching the American flag flutter against a pink sky. He had been an officer once, proud and sharp in his uniform, certain of his country's destiny. Now he stood in khaki rags, the ghosts of ruined cities behind him, the sound of Glenn Miller and laughter drifting from the guardhouse. He could not decide what was worse, the humiliation of defeat or the kindness of the victors. A guard approached, Corporal Miller, the same young man who had escorted him off the train weeks before. You all right there, Lieutenant? Miller asked, resting his rifle casually against the fence post. Becker nodded. Just thinking. About home? Becker smiled faintly. Always about home. But also, he gestured to the camp. About this place. You treat us better than we treated our own forced laborers. Better than we expected, why? Miller shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. Orders, I guess, and maybe that's just how we do it. You're beaten, not broken. There's a difference. Becker studied him for a long moment. A strange kind of mercy, he said quietly. We were told you Americans were, how do you say, barbarians of industry. Soulless machines, Miller laughed, short and genuine. Guess we fooled you, huh? Later, back in his bunk, Becker wrote another letter to his mother. The candlelight wavered as he pressed the pencil to paper. Mother, I must tell you something strange. The Americans are not what we were told. They let us write freely, speak freely, even laugh. They are strict, but not cruel. Their guards talk to us as men, not animals. If this is defeat, then it is not the kind I feared. He paused, tapping the pencil thoughtfully, then added one final line. Perhaps this is what freedom truly looks like, when even your captors are unafraid of your words. 2 days later, Halsey received a letter from Army headquarters. It was an official circular from Washington. All outgoing POW mail must be subject to light censorship only. Personal correspondence should not be restricted except in matters of security. The memo explained, in the dry language of bureaucracy, that such treatment reflected the democratic principles of the United States and the provisions of the Geneva Convention. Halsey folded the paper slowly and tucked it into his breast pocket. He didn't need to be told. He had already seen what decency could accomplish. In the space of a few short weeks, men who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler now talked about peace, about rebuilding, about the future. They had learned that mercy was a weapon, too, but one that healed instead of destroyed. And in that camp, under the heavy summer heat of Louisiana, the letters continued to flow, thousands of them, bridging two worlds with the quiet power of trust. August 1945. The heat had grown thicker, the kind that glued shirts to skin and turned every breath into effort. Camp Ruston simmered under an unbroken sky, its fences shimmering like silver threads in the haze. Inside Barracks 12C, a fan turned lazily above a room full of men hunched over letters, sweating ink onto paper as if each word were wrung from them. The war was over, yes, but the peace had teeth. Letters from Germany had begun to darken in tone. What had once been tender words from wives and mothers were now filled with hunger, ruin, and fear. The Allied bombings had turned cities into ash fields. The postal system crawled across a broken nation. Yet somehow the letters kept arriving, creased, smudged, and precious. Feldwebel Carl Miller unfolded his latest one beneath the weak light from the barracks window. His wife Anna wrote in hurried strokes, the ink diluted as though stretched thin to save it. The house is gone. We stay with your sister in Kassel. Food is scarce. I trade the wedding ring for flour. Our little boy asks when you will come home. The words hit like a physical blow. Miller swallowed hard, tracing his finger along the faint indentation of her handwriting, as if touch alone might bridge the ocean between them. The camp's relative comfort now felt obscene. 3 meals a day, clean water, roof intact. His wife was bartering memories for bread. He folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and tucked it into his breast pocket. She doesn't say it, he murmured to Becker, but I can feel it in her words. She's starving. Becker looked up from his own letter, his expression hollow. Mine says the same. There's no coal for winter. People burn books and furniture to keep warm. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of distant suffering pressing down through the humid air. Outside, Lieutenant Halsey read a new directive from Washington. The United States was beginning to repatriate German POWs, but the process was slow. Months, maybe years. Until then, they were to be kept occupied, employed, and treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Many were already working in local farms, helping harvest crops alongside American civilians who eyed them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Halsey had also noticed another phenomenon: the letters. Those same ones that had astonished the Germans had begun to astonish the Americans too. Local farmers' wives who helped distribute mail often read snippets or overheard translations. They began to realize that these men, once soldiers of the enemy, were not monsters. They were husbands, sons, fathers, writing about the same things Americans did: food, weather, love, faith. It unsettled some people. It softened others. One afternoon, Halsey rode out to a nearby farm where a group of German POWs were helping harvest corn. He found them laughing with a local family's teenage sons, sleeves rolled up, skin tanned to the same shade as the farmers. The war seemed impossibly far away. When Halsey approached one of the farmers' wives, a stout woman with a sunburned neck, handed him a folded envelope. Found this in one of the feed sacks, she said. One of the Germans must have dropped it. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter half written in careful, looping German script. To my wife, Anna. Miller's Halsey looked up and saw the man himself across the field, wiping sweat from his brow. When their eyes met, Miller froze, expecting punishment. Instead, Halsey walked over and held the letter out to him. You dropped something, Halsey said simply. Miller blinked. You read it? Just enough to know who it belonged to, Halsey replied. You'd better finish it. Mail leaves tomorrow. For a moment, the German couldn't speak. Then he nodded, swallowing hard. Danke, Herr Lieutenant. Don't thank me, Halsey said, turning back toward his jeep. Just write her. She's waiting. That night, in Barracks 12C, the air was heavy with the sound of pencil scratching paper. Miller wrote faster than usual, as if the act itself could summon comfort across the sea. Anna, I received your letter. I am safe. I have food and I work in the fields. I think of you every day. Tell our boy I will come home. The Americans, they are not what we were told. They even return lost letters. He paused, the candlelight flickering as the night insects sang beyond the walls. Then he added, almost in disbelief, I write freely. No one stops me. They read, perhaps, but they do not erase. Elsewhere in the camp, Sergeant Lewis sat in her small office, sorting through the day's mail. She had grown weary from reading the same themes: love, loss, hunger. But tonight, one letter caught her eye. The writing was neat, the tone almost philosophical. It was from Becker. He wrote not just of his family, but of what he had begun to understand about America itself. Mother, you must believe me when I tell you this. Freedom here is not a word on banners. It is something they live, even in small things. They allow us to speak because they do not fear truth. I think this is their strength. Lewis read the letter twice before stamping it and setting it aside. Her hand trembled slightly. He understands, she whispered. By late August, the camp's morale had stabilized. There were fewer fights, more laughter. The orchestra performed on Sunday evenings for both prisoners and guards. Sometimes American officers would stand near the back of the crowd, hands clasped behind their backs, pretending they were only there to supervise, but really, they were listening. The letters had done something no weapon could. They had turned enemies into men. And far across the Atlantic, in a shattered Europe, women opened envelopes stamped "Passed by U.S. Censor" and wept, not because of what was missing, but because of what remained, words intact and unbroken. September 1945. The first cool winds began to move across Louisiana, shaking the pine trees that hemmed the edges of Camp Ruston. The heat retreated, and with it came a new rhythm, slower, steadier. The war was no longer fresh news. It was history now, and the men inside the wire could feel that passage of time like the fading echo of a gunshot. The morning roll call was brief. The guards' voices had lost their earlier edge. The prisoners no longer shuffled with the same stiffness. Instead, they greeted one another softly, shoulders straight, hair trimmed, eyes clearer. The letters had worked something unseen inside them, some small repair of the soul. In Barracks 14B, Feldwebel Miller sat at his desk, rereading a reply from Anna. The letter was short, paper scarce, ink watered down, but its tone was stronger. "Carl, your letters keep me alive. The boy sleeps with them under his pillow. He says your words smell like America. We pray for you every night." The line made Miller laugh quietly. "Smell like America," he repeated, shaking his head. She probably means the paper. Becker, sitting opposite him, smiled. Maybe she means freedom. Miller looked up. "Freedom?" Behind barbed wire, Becker folded his own letter and nodded slowly. "Freedom doesn't mean the gates are open. It means you still have a voice inside them." Lieutenant Halsey stood outside the administration building, watching a mail truck bounce down the dirt road, its rear gate rattling like loose armor. He had just received a new shipment of stationery, clean pads, envelopes, pencils, all for the German prisoners. The order had come from Washington again. Encourage written correspondence. Maintain morale. Preserve discipline through humane treatment. He didn't need the memo to know it worked. The difference was visible. Fewer disciplinary cases, no escape attempts in months. Even local townsfolk, once wary, had begun to visit the camp market on weekends to barter with the POWs. Wood carvings, sketches, small trinkets made from scrap metal. One elderly farmer had even said to Halsey, half-jokingly, "You boys sure these fellas are Nazis? They're more polite than half my cousins." Halsey had just smiled and said, "Most of them were soldiers before they were anything else." That was the truth. And letters. Letters had turned them from symbols back into people. Inside the censorship office, Sergeant Lewis sat with a new batch of mail. Her eyes were tired, her fingertips smudged with graphite and dust. She could tell the seasons of war from the tone of the letters. In spring they were desperate. In summer, hopeful. Now in early fall they had turned thoughtful. One letter, written in precise cursive, caught her attention. Becker again. He had become one of her favorites, not that she'd ever admit it. His words carried an almost literary weight. "Mother, I have begun to teach English to some of the other men. The guards even lend us books. We read Mark Twain and Shakespeare. I think the Americans are testing us, not with cruelty, but with kindness. They want to see what we become when treated as men." Lewis paused. For a long moment she looked at the letter in her hands. "Maybe we're testing ourselves too," she murmured. She stamped it, passed by U.S. censor. That evening, the camp orchestra performed again under the open-air pavilion. Violins, a clarinet, a dented trumpet, and a battered piano salvaged from a school gym. The music drifted through the warm night, past the guard towers and over the wire into the Louisiana pines. The Americans gathered along the fence to listen, some with cigarettes glowing in the dark. For a few minutes the difference between uniform colors dissolved. Miller played the violin, his eyes closed, bow hand trembling slightly. The tune was Lily Marlene, slow and mournful, the unofficial anthem of soldiers on both sides. When he finished, there was a silence that stretched long and fragile. Then applause, hesitant at first, then swelling. Corporal Miller, leaning against a fence post, called out, "Play it again, Feldwebel!" Miller grinned, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. "Only if you promise not to shoot the encore." Laughter rippled across both sides of the wire. Later that night, Becker and Miller sat outside their barracks, the stars sharp above them. The crickets filled the silence between sentences. Becker tapped the stub of his pencil against a blank page. "I think," he said slowly, "that when I go home I will tell them everything. About the letters, the food, the guards. They must know the truth," Miller frowned. "And if they don't believe you, they might think you were turned." "Then let them think it," Becker said quietly. "But I'll write it anyway. He began his new letter right there under the stars. Mother, tonight I listened to an American cheer for a German song. We laughed together. I don't know what to call that, mercy maybe. But if this is what the world can be after war, then there is hope. He stopped, looked up at the constellations scattered above the camp, and added one final line. Tell the world they did not fear our words, they answered them. The next morning, Becker's letter joined hundreds of others in the outbound mailbag. Some would take weeks to cross the Atlantic. Some would be lost entirely, but every one of them carried a small piece of something radical. Trust, and somewhere, far away in a bombed-out apartment in Göttingen, an old woman would soon open an envelope that smelled faintly of pine and ink, and read her son's words. For a moment, just a moment, she would believe that decency had survived the war. October 1945. Morning mist clung to the Louisiana fields like gauze, softening the edges of fences, trucks, and tired faces. The war had ended 5 months ago, but for the men of Camp Ruston, its echo still lingered in the air, an invisible hum that no amount of work or laughter could quite silence. Yet something remarkable had taken root behind the wire: routine, dignity, and most astonishing of all, hope. The mailroom doors opened early. Sergeant Anna Lewis, her uniform pressed crisp despite the heat, began sorting the latest batch of letters. The handwriting was now familiar, looping German cursive, some clean and disciplined, others shaky and uneven. To her, each letter was a living pulse. When the war had begun, these men had been faceless enemies. Now they were people with names, with families who baked bread out of potato peels and waited for the sound of boots on their doorsteps. She handled each envelope carefully, aware of the power they carried. A line of ink could break or mend a man. As she stamped the outgoing mail, she glanced up at Lieutenant Halsey, who stood at the doorway with a mug of coffee. "Another 100, she said. "They don't run out of words, do they?" Halsey shook his head. "Guess that's a good thing. Keeps them human." "They write like poets now," Lewis murmured. "Half of them talk about rebuilding, about peace. Some even thank us." Halsey sipped his coffee, watching her work. "If letters can do that," he said, "then maybe they're worth the postage." In Barracks 12C, Becker sat on his bunk, pencil in hand, eyes unfocused. Around him, men prepared for another day of labor, buttoning shirts, folding blankets, talking quietly. But Becker was somewhere else. His latest letter from Germany lay open on his lap, and the words had turned his stomach. "Our city is gray now, Hans. Everything smells of dust. The church where you were baptized is gone. But yesterday we heard that the Americans allow their prisoners to write without fear. The pastor says maybe they are trying to show us another kind of world." Becker folded the letter slowly, as if the paper might bruise. The words "another kind of world" kept repeating in his head. He walked outside, past the laundry lines in the Red Cross hut, and found Feldwebel Müller sitting by the fence, whittling a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. "Another letter from home?" Müller asked without looking up. "Yes," Becker said. "They know now. They know how we're treated. It's spreading." Müller smiled faintly. "Good. Let them know the Americans aren't monsters." Becker nodded. "Maybe they'll start believing that mercy is stronger than hate." Müller chuckled. "Careful, Lieutenant. You sound like a philosopher." Becker shrugged. "Maybe captivity does that to a man." That afternoon, Halsey conducted an inspection of the camp workshops. The Germans were carving furniture for local schools, repairing farm tools, even painting murals on the inside of the dining hall, scenes of forests and rivers, reminders of home. When he stopped by the carpentry shed, he saw a message carved discreetly into the wood above the door: "Vortis in Freiheit." Words are freedom. He ran his hand over the carving. The edges were smooth, deliberate. Someone had taken time to write it properly, not as graffiti but as a statement. He said nothing, just smiled to himself and moved on. By October's end, repatriation lists began to circulate. Some of the men would soon be sent back to Europe, to France for labor, to Britain, eventually to Germany. The news brought mixed feelings: relief, fear, and uncertainty. After all, many of them had found a strange stability here, a rhythm of work, letters, and quiet evenings under the American sky. When Müller's name appeared on the first list, he packed in silence. Becker sat beside him, folding his own few belongings into a duffel. "They'll send me next month," Becker said. Müller nodded. Maybe we'll meet again. In a different world. Becker extended his hand. Miller clasped it firmly. If we do, Becker said, I'll buy you a beer. And you'll tell me if Anna liked all the letters. Miller smiled, eyes glinting. She'll frame them, I think. Proof that even enemies have hearts. On Miller's last day, the camp assembled by the gate. The Red Cross truck idled nearby, the air smelling of fuel and pine resin. Each departing POW received his belongings, a ration pack, and a sealed envelope containing his correspondence. Every letter he had sent and received while in America, bundled together by the censors who once read them. When Miller's turn came, Sergeant Lewis handed him his bundle personally. You wrote beautiful letters, she said softly. They'll mean more to your family than you know. He bowed slightly. Thank you. You treated us as men. That was the idea, she replied. As the truck began to roll away, the men inside waved, some smiling, some weeping silently. Halsey and Lewis stood at the gate, watching them vanish down the dusty road until only the hum of the engine remained. Do you think they'll remember this? Lewis asked quietly. Halsey's eyes followed the disappearing convoy. Every letter they sent home, he said, was a piece of proof that decency survived the war. That's not something a man forgets. Months later, long after the camp had emptied and the fences had begun to rust, a letter arrived at the old mail office. It was addressed simply, to the commanding officer, Camp Ruston, Louisiana, USA. Inside, written in steady German script, was a single page. To the men and women who guarded us with honor, we returned to a broken country, but we brought with us something unbroken, the belief that mercy is stronger than hatred. You let us write freely, and in doing so, you taught us freedom itself. Thank you. Hans Becker. Halsey read it in silence, then folded the paper and placed it in his desk drawer. For a long time, he just stared out the window, watching the last light fade over the empty camp. The war was over, but the words remained.